Hey everybody, welcome to week 7. This is part 2 of our unit on assembling evidence. And I'm going to try to keep this particular lecture very brief because I have some other sources that I want you to look at and listen to, and I will describe those in more detail in this presentation. Okay, so first of all, you notice that what we're going to do this week is use some government websites. We're going to use the US Census. We're going to use the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and we are going to use the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Each of these three sources are just treasure troves of information. Um, and we are going to barely scratch the surface of each of them. That's because they require a significant amount of use for you to become proficient in using them, but they are, again, an excellent source of information. And the data they provide are very useful in a lot of um, policy analysis. And I think you'll see as you read some of the policy analysis literature and some of the websites that contain policy analysis, you'll see quite often that the data that are used as background data on taxes, on population, on um, things like gross domestic product, consumer price index, they come from these sources. And so these sources are the most reliable sources to use for this kind of data. And you should always strive to use these sources for this data. But that's not to say there isn't data available on many other government sources, because there are plenty of sources of data. These are three that are just commonly used. So the other thing I provide this week is I provide several what I call demo videos. Those are on the week 7 tab. There's a file folder on the week 7 tab with these particular demos. I would like you to watch all of those. And then I supply several links to these websites themselves, along with a few explanatory documents about the sites from the official sources. And those are also going to be very useful for you. So as I said, this lecture is going to be very brief because I want you to spend your week looking at those websites and all the supplemental sources. We do have an exercise this week. It is not a discussion. You're going to post your exercise by Friday, but this week, unlike other weeks, no comments to your peers are going to be required. Okay, so again, for this week, read the material provided and review the demos and the other sources. Because here's what we want to understand. We want to understand a few really key items of data that are commonly used in policy analysis, lots of times for background data, but they're commonly used. For example, the gross domestic product is often used as an indicator of the strength of the overall economy. And this can be stated in terms of the national GDP or a state GDP. GDP briefly is the total value of all goods and services produced in the nation or the state within a given time period. And then there's the consumer price index, which you've heard of probably a lot, the CPI. The fact is there are different measures of CPI. There are at least three main measures that the Bureau of Economic Analysis uses uh, to measure CPI, and they're all slightly different. But briefly, the CPI it's an index, and it shows the cost of consumer goods, and it's constructed from a hypothetical shopping basket, if you will, of goods that consumers would buy. And so this becomes an indicator of the overall rate of inflation in the economy. And then population. And so you would say, well, population just is, but actually population is indicative of many things. For example, if over a 10-year period, a state is losing population or a state is growing at a much slower rate than the national average of growth, you would ask why. You might also ask why a particular state is growing faster, much faster than the overall rate in the United States. And so population, even though it seems like a static number, can actually prompt many questions in your mind. And then revenue and sources of revenue, such as taxation. All political units tax their citizens and businesses, but the methods and rates of taxation vary greatly. So there are really hundreds of indicators that can be found on these three government websites. Um, and of course, we're only dealing with a few this week. There's other data like unemployment rates, government employment, median household income, um, expenditures by state. So the point of this week's exercise is to get you familiar with these sources of data. And as you explore them, you will see, hopefully, you will see information and data that might be useful for your own policy analysis project. And in the future, when you need these kinds of data, you know where to look. But often when you look at this information, it's very confusing, right? And there's reasons for that. One is looking at the census, for example, you will see population numbers that vary internally on the census site. For example, the 2010 census population numbers will be different than the American Community Survey numbers that the census also is in charge of. And this has to do with the way these numbers are derived. Economic numbers such as CPI might vary because there's different kinds of CPIs. Information varies between government websites because of collection criteria. And so the point is that I want you to become familiar with these sources of data and how they're collected so that when you do present them in a project, you should understand that there is some slight variance in the numbers, and you should always strive to be consistent with the kinds of data you're using. So for example, if you're using population estimates from the American Community Survey, you should try to be consistent across all the units, all the states, for example, that you're comparing. Don't mix and match the decennial census population numbers with the ACS numbers, for example. And you're only going to understand that as you become more familiar with these websites. So as I said, this is a really brief discussion. I'm going to come in under 10 minutes, which is good because the demos are going to take up about 50 minutes of your time too. So this week's discussion, I'm going to have you develop a Microsoft Excel or other readable spreadsheet, and I'd like you to, once you finish it, put it in a presentable table format that, for example, you could paste onto your policy analysis project. And I want you to cover the following political units, and I list them there. There's 10 states plus the United States in total. I want you to use the years 2007 and 2012, so 2 different years. And on this table, I want you to provide this information. So the population of the states for the applicable years, the state GDP in constant 2012 dollars, the per capita GDP, and you can figure that out if you know once you know the population and the GDP in 2012 dollars, the dollar amount of elementary and secondary school funding provided by 3 different sources: federal sources, state sources, and local sources, and then the percentage of elementary and secondary school funding that is provided by these sources, the percentage of the entire school expenditure, if you will, and then the per capita dollar amount of taxes in current dollars for each state for the applicable years. And then I want you to make some comments on how useful you found this exercise and comment on whether or not you found anything that surprised you. So again, I'm in under just 10 minutes for this lecture, but do look at the demos, look at all the information I provide you, and I think you'll find this exercise useful as a data collection exercise that will potentially help you as you develop your policy analysis projects. Thanks a lot.